Итак, на нашем втором дне форума осталось.
So at our second day of the forum, we have the most interesting last but one section. I'd like to introduce Andrei Illarionov, Senior Research Fellow of Cato Institute, Washington, United States, and the President of Economic Analysis Institute. We will discuss the Economic Freedom Index. This presentation, the research of Cato Institute, is available at your memory sticks. You can read it later, and you can use it in your research. Let's welcome Andrei. Good evening, dear colleagues. The topic has been announced, and even those who had the chance yesterday to spend the time not only at the party but with your laptop, you could have read the text of the presentation on Personal Freedom Index that is available at your memory stick. For those who haven't done that yet, I'd like to show you the presentation. This is how it looks like, the Human Freedom Index that was published by the Cato Institute in August this year. As the first edition, I'd like to tell you about the history of establishment, of creation of this index, and the presentation, and also the contents, the philosophical base of this index. And then I'd like to discuss some results that we have. I hope that... Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. And some results that we got and that appears in this presentation. If you talk about history, the Personal Freedom Index is the child of another index that many of you know well. This is the Economic Freedom Index. Economic Freedom Index issued within 20 years by a big consortium on the network of economic freedom supporters that includes the institutes, think tanks, the groups in 96 countries. This is the network of supporters of economic freedom. It was established in 1995, 1996. It is expanding every year, and the index itself appeared in the interesting way. Maybe it makes sense to say a couple of words on that. In 1982, it's one of the sessions of Montpellier societies, the Society of Supporters of Classical Liberalism and Libertarianism. One of the active members of the society, one of the best economists and the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century, Milton Friedman, participating in the discussion, asked the question to the colleagues, to the audience. The question was the following: can we say today, is the United States more free today than the United States 50 years ago, and the United States 100 years ago? Is it more free or less free? The question provoked boisterous discussion and response, and just like in any question, it was about the system of measurements. The notion of economic freedom appeared in 1982, and after that, a lot of conferences and seminars and brainstorming took place with participation of several Nobel Prize winners, several scores of economists and other specialists. And by 1996, 14 years later, we had the first version of Economic Freedom Index, which was issued by the group of institutes, think tanks. The leader was and is Fraser's Institute from Vancouver in Canada. The active co-publisher and co-producer of Index of Economic Freedom is the Cato Institute. And since then, for 20 years, the Economic Freedom Index is improved, refined, the annual reports are published, and the circle of countries covered by the index is expanded. In the recent publication, they have more than 150 countries covered. This index of economic freedom proved to be very interesting, not only academically, but also practically. Many people who participate in business and investment projects found a sustainable link not only between the indicators that are discussed in the presentation, like in the report, like economic freedom and economic growth rates, the level of economic development, the life expectancy, the child mortality, and many other economic and social indicators. It's proved that the Economic Freedom Index is quite powerful mid-term predictor of the success of business projects and investment projects. This is what the developers of index never expected. At least they never thought about this, and they never counted on that, but still this is what happened. And now there are publications on the Economic Freedom Index. There are several thousands of titles published. There are articles and books and other academic studies. About 10 years ago, inspired by the success of this project, the authors and the supporters met, and I offered the idea to go beyond the economic freedom concept only and to try to look at the world wider, as economic freedom, no doubt, is one of the most important freedoms, but it's not the only one which is important for humans. Besides economic freedom, there are other freedoms. There are personal freedoms, private freedoms, public freedoms. There are freedoms that are not related to economy. And then we started our new work that continued for 9 years, which also involves a great number of people, different experts. In this room we had Tom Palmer, who also participated in the conceptual work on the concept itself of human freedom and the index of human freedom. Also, many others were involved. We had several difficult crises when it was very difficult to overcome the problems with contents, but we managed to do it. And as I said, in August this year, the first report was published. Although the report is available, I'd like to use this opportunity to discuss the content part of the problem of human freedom and the index of human freedom, because you have this opportunity to look at methodology, to look at the numbers, to compare, to analyze. The material is very informative. It will be updated, and very soon we'll have new publication with new data, with recent years, and you will be able to discuss it as well. But I'd like to introduce you to the discussions that we had that continue among the authors of this index and among the supporters who share this opinion, although on many issues we continue intensive discussions. First and foremost, the notion of freedom that many times was mentioned today and yesterday, and which is dear to many of us. It has two dimensions, positive and negative. Many of you in this room are familiar with this division. I'd like to remind it to those who have forgot about this, or just newly arrived people. The positive freedom is the freedom to dispose resources. So these are opportunities, is the capability to do something, physical, technical. And negative freedom is the freedom from the ban, from limitation that is established not by natural, physical limits and opportunities, but by legal, moral, human, societal, social, family, personal, and other limitations. If someone or something in human society limits you, limits any individual in performing some project, some action, this division and allocation of this negative freedom, because from the perspective of classical liberalism, libertarianism, we discuss negative freedom. The negative freedom, this division is especially precise, and it's the merit of Isaiah Berlin, one of the famous philosophers of the 20th century. In his work of 1956, he describes this problem in detail. So when we, although in regular speech you can encounter formulations like the money is printed freedom. This is true, but this is the positive freedom. If you have money, you can do a lot of things. You can buy, you can convince, you can make different things, but this is not the freedom we talk about. We talk about freedom from bans, freedom from limitations imposed by the person or by the human society in some embodiments. This is the first consideration. Second point, which is very important, we need to define in what are the areas that should be touched, and what are the areas that are really important to understand the general concept of human freedom. After lengthy discussions, some of us arrived to the conclusion, although what I say is the result of lengthy discussions, everything that I see is my personal responsibility, first of all. We see four main areas in which these manifestations of human freedom are the most important. So the first and basic one is the area in the name of which we don't have the word freedom, is the security. And the security is an absolute priority, because security provides survival of the human, and they predefine the opportunity for any other freedoms. If our basic security is not guaranteed, not even basic security, but security for humans, for their health, then regardless of the position of other freedoms, maybe for the individual it will be not so important. So first is security. We're not saying how the security is guaranteed. We just say that security is the groundworks for the presence of human freedom. And the rest of the freedoms, we can think about them, we can discuss them. Freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of economic activity, freedom of trade, and so on. Freedom of personal life, freedom of dressing the way you want, freedom of food, freedom of consumption of some products or drinks, or whatever. All this gigantic sea of various freedoms can be grouped into three big categories. First, personal freedoms. Freedom of individual to act the way he wants toward themselves, toward his own body, when no one else is next to them, when the individual can do whatever they want to themselves. This is what we call personal freedoms. There is a famous expression, my home is my castle, what I do at home, no one has the right, at least in most societies, to intrude into this. And what I do with my body, how I dispose my body, even if I dispose my body in a criminal way, as many people would believe. I have the property of my body, my brain, it belongs to me. Personally, it belongs to the subject regardless of consequences. I have to bear all the consequences from my decisions in this regard. Second great area is private area. It's the area of relationships of one person with another. Usually there can be two or more individuals if this is the family. And this area is the area in which we have the second person or other people. In the first area, the area of relationships to yourself, to your own body, it is almost not regulated in most societies, although we know that some societies establish regulations and bans or consumption of some products for use of some substances, even in case if it's about one person. But for the majority of societies that are called civilized, there are no limitations, no substantial limitations. As regards the second area, the private area in which we have the second person, is the area which becomes the subject for regulation, at least in all societies. In all societies, this area is regulated to some extent, because here we have relationships in the family, relationships of intimate nature, relationships of economic nature, and here we have second person or third person that intervene. And we have third or fourth area, it's the public area. And this area relates to freedom of association, freedom of manifestations, public, political freedom, and so on. And this area, at least, I think at most society, this area is much more regulated than the previous two areas. What is important to keep in mind? The freedom, any types of freedom are, we can apply standard economic terminology and standard economic approaches to these freedoms. There is demand for freedom and there is supply of freedom. As regards to the demand for freedom, the convincing model which would describe the demand for freedom in the absolute volume or in structure or in the preferences of one freedom to another does not exist. Every one of us is individual. Every one of us is specific, and individual preferences to different freedoms, to different actions are unique. Your neighbor, you can ask your neighbor, your relatives, your family members, and even yourself in different periods of time, you have different preferences to different activities. They're different. We have different preferences about the microphone. They look pretty much the same to me. So this problem of demands, individual demand for freedom, creates the philosophical and practical problem which almost cannot be resolved. How can we measure the thing for which we don't have the common denominator? How can we compare what is more important, more significant, more valuable? The demands of one individual for the visit to the cinema, for another person this is the demand for reading a book, for another it's the visit to the party, for the sixth is the visit to the restaurant, for the seventh is the visit to our conference, and someone else wants to travel somewhere else, and so on and so forth. What's the common balance? What's the common denominator that can be offered? There is no common denominator. If someone finds it, maybe in terms of in the part of Q&A, I'll be glad to hear that. And the attempts to find this common denominator brought us to the condition of collapse almost. But it proves that we can find some common denominator, but not for the demands for freedom, but for the supply of freedom. And if we think about this, among different sectors existing in the society, there is a special sector, a special industry, which is called the production of supply of freedom. What do you think? What's that? what I'm talking about. Who produces freedom? Who in Ukraine, in Russia, in Georgia, in other countries, in Sweden, who produces freedom? It's clear that people, but who? The power, the government. Does the Marxism education produce freedom? What's the answer? Who produces freedom? The legislator. One of the most important sectors, the most important industries that produces freedom and non-freedom. These are the legislature bodies, the regulators, the executive power branch. Also, well-known and respected people, religious organizations, NGOs, creators of models, moral models, ethical models, who create role models which society starts to follow. This is the specific industry of production of the supply of freedom and non-freedom, because in different societies, the same agencies, the same people can produce more or less freedom, and sometimes they systematically may produce non-freedom and liquidate freedoms. But in principle, the industry which does that is, first of all, the public agencies and the bodies that produce bans, permits, that remove bans, that establish bans, that create models, liquidate models, replace models. And if we reach this stage and we realize that we have this common denominator because we have the opportunity to measure and to compare what are the scopes of potential freedom which are produced by the public agencies in some societies, in some countries, and we can compare it, we can measure it. We can measure what are the terms and conditions created for people living and acting in some society. In other words, when we say about freedom levels, we mean levels produced by the conditions. How do we use these conditions? No one knows. Maybe we will use these conditions, maybe not. Maybe they will exist, but we'll have this resource, this potential. If this potential, this ceiling is reduced, if it is brought to foundation, then there is almost no opportunity for that. Quite recently, a couple of months ago, in the beginning of October, the Nobel Prize winners were announced, as usual. And this year, the Nobel Prize in Literature was awarded to whom? Svetlana Alexievich. Svetlana Alexievich is the citizen of another country. Is she related to Ukraine? She is related to Ukraine. She was born in Ivano-Frankivsk. She is the citizen of Belarus. She writes in Russian. What's interesting?
So, was born in Ivano-Frankivsk. What is historical name of Ivano-Frankivsk? That's excellent. Stanislav. Before 1918, what country it was in? Between 1920 and 1939, was it part of Poland? Before 1918, it was Austro-Hungary. I mean the city of Stanislav, not Svetlana. What is interesting? Over nearly 100 years plus of issuance of Nobel awards, there was quite a large database developed. The prizes were given to nearly 1,000 people in various fields. physics, healthcare, chemistry, literature. Lightly, they began to issue awards in the economics, even for achievements in the field of peace. If you look into the prizes issued in natural sciences, including literature, not including achievements in peacemaking, because it is rather political. Look into Nobel Prize winners who were born in the territory which previously was territory of the Russian Empire and former Soviet Union. So what is eye-catching? Do you have any ideas? Where quite many Nobel Prize winners were born. Israel. Not really. Israel was only established 1947. Maybe there was a few of Nobel Prize winners. It's interesting where Nobel Prize winners are working in their adult condition. Where do they have the labs, if they're scientists, or where do they write? They become famous, they become rich. They can now choose place of residency. When someone is born, it's kind of random. Talented people with all conditions being equal are born equally on the planet. However, the opportunity to realize their potential is something that few people have. Those who had an opportunity to realize that unique potential, who could become Nobel Prize winners in the territory of Russian Empire. There are 3 places which are substantially different by density of Nobel Prize winners. Naturally, one place is Moscow, because it's a capital city over that time, and ability by living standards and by education, by concentration of parents having higher wealth, is pretty obvious. Another predictable place is St. Petersburg. The 3rd place, which by density is even higher than Moscow and St. Petersburg, is the territory of the former Rzeczpospolita and former Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this is about the territory which is now the territory of Ukraine, the territory which is now part of the current Belarus, part of the territory which is now Lithuania and modern Poland. The number of Nobel Prize winners per million of population who have lived within that period, end of 19th century, beginning of and middle of 20th century, end of 20th century, beginning of 21st century. The density of Nobel Prize winners in those areas is at the level of Moscow, even slightly above, and far above the level of St. Petersburg. There is a question why. What are the hypotheses? What kind of hypothesis? Degree of freedom, how it can be measured? Why in the estates of the nobility in other places? Most probably, 2 main factors are, first, Magdeburg law, which existed only in that part of the former Russian Empire and which created totally different legal conditions. compared to other places. The law is a product which creates freedom industry. Magdeburg law, at least in this part of Europe, provided for the highest standards, which were given not only by having self-governance in the cities or an opportunity of being independent from the feudal owners outside of the city. Also, in case of final decision, in case of a dispute, it was taken not in that city, but by city court of the city of Magdeburg, which was beyond Russian Empire and even beyond Austro-Hungarian Empire or Rzeczpospolita. The conditions provided by Magdeburg law are unique. It's not by chance that Kievites 200 years ago plus, have built the monument to Magdeburg law. This is the only monument of that kind on the globe. It was mentioned by Kakhabin Dukidze. That was built not to the king, not to the emperor, not to the hero, not to any mythological creatures. It was actually built to such an abstract notion as Magdeburg law. Quite many people know that monument. It's not a small monument, it's a large monument. It's obvious that it costs a lot of money, and that monument was built not on the emperor's money, not on the state budget. It was built on contributions, donations of Kievites, residents of the city of Kiev, who had Magdeburg law, and who, by their own experience, could get convinced how that Magdeburg law protects themselves in their city, compared to what is happening outside of that city under conditions of Russian Empire. Though at that time it was incomparable with what happened later. So the first element is law. This is the product of industry to produce freedom. Another instrument is territory of Rzeczpospolita. This is the only territory which with more than 6 years, they had regular elections of all government bodies, Seims and Semics, including elected position of the king. The king, when he was elected, lasted on his position for life, but when he died, then position of the king was not inherited. The new king was elected. In Europe, in all other places, except for Poland and neighboring Germany, the leader of the country was inherited position. In Rzeczpospolita, the kings were elected. Unlike neighboring Germany, in Germany, the emperors were elected, inherited monarchy. There were Kurfürst that, in line with Golden Bull, have elected the emperor. In Rzeczpospolita, it was not the case. The nobility elected them. The free noblemen having political rights. The rights to, they were 10% of the population. None of the other countries of Europe had things like that. Actually, that bias existed for centuries and generations. Dozens of generations have grown with. Magdeburg law and political freedom have created conditions to bring up a huge number of people who, by their intellectual potential, far exceeded everyone who was in the neighboring places. It's not by chance that explosion of intellect that took place in the territory of former Rzeczpospolita in 19th century and 20th century is a unique one. It didn't happen elsewhere. This is the result of the Institute of Freedom for a number of centuries. We can, of course, continue saying how did they operate. At least you are lucky, you have part of the territory of the country where such institutions have worked for a number of years. You have examples using them, based on them, you can develop institutions of freedom here and now. For other countries were less lucky. They didn't have such historical institutes. They have to create them anew. If there is no such base, it's more difficult for them. It's easier for you. However, judging from the data of the Index of Human Liberty that you have prepared, it is found that in the year 2012, this is the last data we had all comparable data about. It will be the year 13. We shall have a look at it. Ukraine, 152 countries. So what are your proposals? What is the place of Ukraine? 130th? Ukraine, 74th place. Not bad. It's in the middle of the list. Actually, the Index of Human Liberty in interpretation consists of the two main blocks. Due to limited data and due to philosophical discussions, we could not include all those spheres that I believe necessary. My colleagues have another viewpoint. There were two main blocks. Index of Economic Liberty consists of Index of Economic Freedom. It is well known, well developed. Second index is Personal Liberty. The Index of Personal Liberty includes such indicators as legal protection, safety, freedom from murders, disappearances, terror, safety of women, especially security of women, freedom of movement inside the country and abroad, religious freedom, liberty to create associations, liberty to hold rallies, organize political parties, professional organizations, freedom of expression, freedom of media, and freedom from pressure, freedom from matters of journalists, and freedom from freedom of personal relations, including personal intimate relations. All those are components of a block called personal liberty. If you look at the position of Ukraine, 74, in that rating, it is found. What do you think? If you take two blocks, economic liberty and personal liberty, Ukrainians, about the world average, what indicator is higher, personal liberty or economic liberty? Of course, you're right. The level of personal liberty is remarkably higher. It's not about political liberty, it's about political liberties. So, components of personal liberty. Elections, political liberties are not included. Freedom of expression, freedom of getting information does exist. For the personal liberties, Ukraine's position is rather high. Economic liberty is rather low. That actually, what do you think, which country is most free in the world? Best versions, good variant, Switzerland. At least by the results that we had, you have relevant flash memory to study the data. It's interesting, if you look into the countries, you can look into the rating. Let's say United States, were on 20th place, post-Soviet country, which was on the top place, probably predictable. Estonia on 22nd place, followed by Lithuania, followed by Latvia. Then Georgia. What are the hypotheses about Russia? Could you quote some number? Who said 110? Nearly right, 111. It's interesting. Russia lagged behind Ukraine by personal liberties quite substantially. What about economic liberties? Practically the same place, at least by those results. However, it seems to me that by liberty of doing business, maybe Russia is ahead of Ukraine. One of the important observations that we find from comparison of personal liberties, economic liberties, for the countries of the world, the following thing is found. Two groups of the countries of the world, or two models, conventional, that can be quoted as Western and Eastern. For the West model, West culture, which includes most of European countries, North American countries, Latin American countries, Central European, East European countries. Personal liberty, not always, but normally, is relatively higher compared to economic liberties. For countries of Eastern model, for the countries of Eastern Asia, Southeast Asia, Middle Asia, Russia, indicators of economic liberty are relatively higher than personal liberty. As this phenomenon is rather massive, maybe it's not by chance. Maybe it's a reflection of some in-depth institutional basis of existence of various societies. So you have database, you can have a look. As an overall phenomenon, if you look into the groups, it's practically everywhere. You can have a look. I will probably complete the introduction. Maybe I can answer your questions. We still have a few minutes. So your questions now. I wanted to clarify about Magdeburg law. It covered 2-3% of the population. 10% the nobility had the right to elect. At least from territory of Ukraine, 6 Nobel Prize winners are all Jews who had nothing to do with Magdeburg law. And therefore, I believe the system of education is important. It's a childhood, and they all came from poor families. In another part of Russian Empire, there were neither 2% of the population living in the Magdeburg law, nor 10% of nobility who could have the right to participate in the political process. Population among the Nobel Prize winners in the territory of Rzeczpospolita, there are representatives of all kinds of ethnic groups, including Jews, Ukrainians, Poles, Germans. Therefore, this question is not ethnic. Actually, this is the one that I discussed. The institutions to produce freedom, of conditions for free development. There are more Jews among Nobel Prize winners other than representatives of other nations is well known. This is related to specificities of education. For quite many centuries, by the way, prohibitions for the Jews to get involved in agriculture, to own land, and therefore they had to be involved in other things, including getting education. However, even if we put aside this ethnic group, by all others, there are still a huge excess of representatives who were born in the territory of former Rzeczpospolita, by the number of Nobel Prize winners compared to any other area of the empire, of the Russian Empire. Former Soviet Union, and even if you look into the territory of, it's a territory which was under control of Austro-Hungarian Empire. other parts of Austro-Hungarian Empire did not produce so many Nobel Prize winners per capita as it happened in Galicia and Lodomeria.
Следующий вопрос, пожалуйста, формулируйте максимально коротко, чтобы мы услышали всех.
Please formulate your question in a concise way. Good evening. You also speak of one of the dimensions of personal liberty, the social, political questions, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. Lately, we could hear an opinion among the people that in order to develop the economy for some time, it's necessary to limit freedom of assembly, freedom of expression. So a small group of persons must receive extraordinary power for legislation, legislative and executive power. Do you think this idea is valid? It's not valid. I knew that. How to convince those people they are wrong, that they are wrong? Using all possible arguments. I hope you have those. The point is that that concept is popular. Especially they like it in Kremlin, and the relevant people are involved in it. For small payment, they tell that dictatorship for economic progress is very useful, and so on. No, it is not. This is just a falsification of real history. It's well known. Whatever. There are no such examples. There are some for some short period of time. There can be coincidence. However, even in cases in there is dictatorship, about Pinochet, there are 100 Robert Mugabes. Even Pinochet, who did cope d'état, and he believed his main achievement are not the economic reforms that became legendary. Those economic reforms had about Chicago boys, and the ones our colleagues wrote a lot of good things about. The main achievement of Pinochet, when he was retired for a long time, and when he was asked, and they expected what he will say, maybe reforms that have transformed Chile from outdated, poor crisis affected into the most dynamic country of Latin America. He said no, the main thing was constitution. I have developed and could approve the constitution providing for the basis of law, not the Magdeburg law, but actually those were the same legal basis of free society for Chile. In line with that constitution, Pinochet achieved that it is approved. They held a referendum about confidence in Pinochet. By that referendum, I don't remember, about 48% of Chileans voted for confidence in Pinochet, 52 against. In our areas, such numbers cannot be quoted because any of the Turans who is telling such fairy tales out of 48% will make 50. It's even funny to discuss. They did different numbers from yet another numbers. It's not for me to tell you what Pinochet did. There was no discussion about falsification of results. The problem was that General Pinochet was educated not in the college named after Frunze. He was trained in West Point. And the idea that he can falsify elections did not emerge in the head of himself or any of his proponents. In principle, that's for some of your compatriots and our compatriots, that's an idea which is impossible. After that, in accordance to the regulations of the Constitution, over 6 months he retired. Free elections was held, new president was elected, the parliament was elected, and Pinochet left his office. Well, this is what the law means. The law which is followed by the creator of that law. And he believes this is his best achievement. When Washington, George Washington, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, was visited by officers with a complaint against the Congress of the United States, which didn't pay them salary for 6 or 8 months, maybe over a year. In the end of 18th century, in Europe, all of the countries are monarchies. The last republic, Rzeczpospolita, were taken away by 3 empires, Russian and Austrian. And then they suggest Washington to do a coup d'état, to overthrow Congress on a legal basis, because they pay no salary, pay no wages to the military. General Washington, who enjoyed huge popularity and trust, he defeated Britons, ousted him over the ocean. He adheres to most progressive convictions. He gathered officers' assembly and made a speech about importance of absolute need of observation of the law. After that, he went to Philadelphia, where the Congress was sitting, and he surrendered his authority as commander-in-chief and went to his estate in Vermont. Over some time, he was visited by the delegation requesting him to participate in the elections as a candidate for presidency of the United States with a limited term. It demonstrates that the key role for providing for institutions of liberty, law, political freedom are played by the people who themselves observe such rules. Not someone from the side, not a person with a gun, not a policeman. They themselves observe, because they themselves are free people. Free people, decent people, honest people, that who themselves oblige and by their example show how to do it. The next question. Two very specific questions. My name is Andrei. The first question, when you were talking of safety in the methodology, did you take into account that was there a ranking between crime based on hatred compared to crime committed without hatred, just with motives of robbery, contract murders, or it was not ranked, just a number of murders? For a person who dies, there is no difference. What were their background feelings that he or she were deprived of life because? And you also ranked the freedom of movement. Did you take into account that what groups of the population are released from the country or not released? And also which countries are easier for them to enter, which countries they have visas for? It's about conditions for the freedom of movement created by the society. If European Union gives no visa-free access, it's not related to the institution of liberty created by Ukrainian state, Ukrainian government, for citizens of Ukraine and for other citizens who would like to come to Ukraine. That's important. As European Union is doing for themselves, this is their problem. Those are the constraints they create in their territory. For Ukraine or any other country, those conditions which are created here are really important. When in Georgia the reforms were held, one of the most radical reforms that was held by Kachebenukidze was cancellation of visas, Georgian visas for citizens of 90 countries. Or something. It was done unilaterally, not even waiting for reciprocity from their side. The same as with Washington, George Washington. They do this not because someone else is convincing them, or on a reciprocity basis. They believe it is right, and this is indeed made a huge impact on success of Georgia.
The same can be done in Ukraine. Why not?
Остается время на два коротких
We
вопроса.
have the time for 2 quick questions. Svetlana, I have a question. It's on the topic, but not really. Based on the freedoms and what you said about the people who bring the rights and who adhere to it in the modern political elite, in what countries? Can you name the countries in which there are people who bring the law and who stick to the law? And these are not dictators. Frankly, the European tradition, European legal tradition, is the lead in the Western and Central Europe and North America and Eastern Asia. These are people and institutions, and these are models developed for ages. From the human experience, this is what we have developing on our rise. Some countries recently started this way, and they demonstrate even greater success than old Europe, for example. In the rule of law index, Singapore and Hong Kong are ahead of the majority of European countries. 40 years ago, you couldn't have imagined that. The favorite example of Cato was in Singapore. When Singapore became independent from Malaysia in 1965, during 20 years, the Supreme Court was not established. The Supreme Court for Singapore was the Royal Court in London, because it realized, like one year, that at that point in Singapore, although it was a small country at that time, they don't have enough judges and lawyers who can judge fairly according to the law. So, during 2 decades, the functions of Supreme Court of Singapore were performed by the Royal Court of London. After they accumulated the appropriate human resources, they gradually were able to refuse from this and move to their own court. This is the revolutionary idea, to borrow, to import the most important public institutions. The idea that some public institutions have to be located in your territory in the city of Kiev. What are the courts that we have that are well known? You know it very well. It's well known. Just like we have Basmanny court, you have Petersburg court, is the same. The last question, unfortunately. You are able, by the way, proposed this, to borrow, to import Canadians of Ukrainian origin as judges. Very reasonable idea for the transition period for 20 years. To ask the Supreme Court of Canada to perform the functions of Supreme Court of Ukraine. Why not? I have a question on today's Ukrainian reality. For 2 years in Ukrainian publications, we have pro-Western establishment. Are you sure? Pro-European. Are you sure? This is my assumption. For 2 years, that's not pro-Russian, it's pro-European. No, it's not pro-Russian. I have doubts about that, by the way. Even if it's not pro-Russian, is it really pro-European? It is supported by the West. The West supports the King of Saudi Arabia as well, right? It's not pro-Russian. The fact that it's not pro-Russian doesn't mean anything. Russian authorities reached the level that now no one is pro-Russian in this world. We have the list of enemies of Russian Federation today, or the Kremlin. It is published. It is called the Big Atlas of the World. Then I would ask my question in the following format. 2 years after Maidan, how much this indicator of human freedom changed in these 2 years after Maidan in Ukraine? Let's check. We cannot check now because our last year is 2012. You need to take this and to evaluate. Why do you need my assumptions? We have the methodology, we have indicators. These indicators are comparable to other countries. This is important, it's interesting, but it's not just interesting for you. Politically or psychologically, it's very important for you to know what happened in the last 2 or 3 years, even compared to last year of Yanukovych. Take these indicators and build your Ukrainian index of human freedom for this period on key parameters. Look at economic freedom. Do we have more taxes or less taxes? Is the budget deficit greater, smaller? The public debt, is it greater or smaller? GDP, did it rise or did it decline? So you need to do it in every category. What are the limitations introduced by the National Bank for the foreign currency use? What is currency? Why foreign currency is different from something else? Why they have some controls there? And so on. Regarding political freedoms and civil freedoms, all the material is at your hand. You can do it, calculate it, discuss it with the colleagues, make a presentation in this room in 1 year or maybe earlier. Let's discuss it together, how the index of human freedom changed personal freedoms, make it wider, not only this. Personal freedoms, economic freedoms, private freedoms, and political freedoms. Let's discuss it. This magazine will support your initiative if it appears. Thank you, Andrei.